Okay, so today we're talking about attachment theory, which I think it's fair to say is one of those ideas that people either swear by or they roll their eyes at, right?
You already know which camp I'm in. Every time someone tells me that they have anxious attachment or anxiously attacked, I just brace myself for pseudoscience.
Well, you've never exactly hidden your feelings about it, have you? So
No,
let, let's try and start sensibly, because the original idea wasn't rubbish altogether, was it? You know, John Bowlby in the 50s was trying to understand kind of what happens when children experience early separation or inconsistent care. And then Mary Ainsworth came along with the strange situation experiments and found that patterns of secure, avoidant, ambivalent, based on how infants behaved when their mothers would leave and then return, right?
right, and in that narrow, very narrow
Very
context,
narrow.
it made sense. It was a way to observe how infants sought safety. The trouble is, somewhere along the way, as turns out with all pseudoscientific nonsense, it turned into astrology for adults. People started taking a set of infant behaviors and using them to label their love lives. It's ridiculous.
Right, okay, I'll admit that bit absolutely makes me wince. That it's just like the number of people diagnosing themselves or their partners as avoidant because they don't reply to texts fast enough. That, I mean, it's fairly impressive, really.
Right, exactly. But here's the thing. The original studies were small, minuscule small, and the effects were modest at best. And yet it's been turned into a pop psychology empire almost. You know, Chris Fraley's 2002 meta-analysis found that attachment patterns predict adult outcomes weekly at best. At
Wow.
best. And then you've got Roisman and his colleagues from the Minnesota longitudinal study. Decades of data showing that those early patterns don't map neatly into adulthood once you factor in environment, personality, and crucially, culture.
Well, right. And that last one, as you said, crucially, it's really important, isn't it? Culture, you know, because attachment theory assumes a very, very Western, white, middle class idea of parenting, that there's one primary caregiver, and it's, of course, usually the mother, and that the expectation that a child should use her as a secure base. Whereas in many societies, children are cared for communally. You know, there's grandparents and siblings, neighbours, and they grow up perfectly secure without that one singular attachment figure, don't they?
They do, which tells us that the mode just isn't universal. It's
Right.
cultural.
Right.
Yet therapists talk about secure attachment as if it's a biological imperative rather than a social construct. And don't even get me started on these endless online quizzes. You know, which attachment style are you? Nonsense. Nonsense.
Right. Total nonsense. And I think that's where people probably mistake metaphor for a map, don't they? You know, the framework gives language to how people manage closeness and distance, but it's not a diagnostic tool, because in therapy, for example, I might notice patterns that resemble attachment responses, but I'm not going to give someone an avoidant badge, am I?
Right. Well, this is why you're one of the few who uses it properly. Most of what gets called attachment work is just therapists projecting a moral hierarchy. Secure equals good, anxious equals needy, avoidant equals cold. It's
Right.
lazy thinking. Lazy thinking.
I mean, you know, it does appeal though, doesn't it? Because people love a simple explanation. I get why people get into that lazy thinking, because they want the simple explanation for why relationships go wrong. Because saying something like, my partner's avoidant, sounds easier than we don't communicate well and I'm terrified of rejection, right?
For sure. I mean, it's seductive, and it's seductive because it offers identity. You know, humans love categories.
Right.
It's the same reason that star signs persist, or DISC, or Myers-Briggs, or any of these. But the research simply doesn't back the permanence of these categories. Adult
Right.
attachment measures, like self-report ones like the ECR, they barely correlate with the more rigorous adult attachment interview. So if your tools don't agree, your
Right.
theory is probably overextended.
Right, for sure. And then the idea that your attachment style is fixed from infancy is completely misleading. And because even the most
Right.
loyal Bowlby scholars would admit that attachment style is fluid, because relationships, therapy, stress, trauma, they all shift it. You can't take a test at 35 and declare yourself doomed by your parents, can you?
But this is exactly what people do. Oh, I'm anxious, anxiously attached because my mother once forgot sports day. Meanwhile, life factors like sleep, alcohol, financial stress, conflict skills are far bigger predictors of relationship satisfaction. These get ignored because they're less romantic to analyze, I suppose.
Well, yeah, I suppose. And I mean, you've always said you prefer parsimony, the simplest explanation that fits the evidence, right?
Right, correct. If two people are arguing constantly, it's usually because of how they argue, not because one's, disorganized or avoidant. You fix communication patterns, not childhoods. And while we're on that, people forget there are actual attachment disorders in the diagnostic manuals, and they have got nothing to do with adult relationships. So in the ICD and the DSM, there are only two, not all of the made-up ones that we have in attachment theory. There is reactive attachment disorder and there's disinhibited social engagement disorder. Both are incredibly rare and both occur in children who've experienced severe neglect. And I'm not just talking, mummy left me to cry. I'm talking about severe neglect or institutional care. So with RAD, reactive attachment, the child doesn't seek comfort even when it's available. And with DSED, they have no sense of safety around strangers. So there's serious developmental problems here, not personality quirks or dating styles. This is my biggest problem with attachment theory.
I mean, I get it. I mean, and that's an important distinction because those are about real deprivation, not someone that's, who's getting nervous if their partner doesn't text back, right?
Exactly that. And what people call attachment issues, most of the time, are actually learned behaviors. So responses to upbringing, experience, even social conditioning. And sometimes that conditioning is cultural. Take boarding school, for example.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. Your favourite example, is it not?
But it's a perfect one. You send a child off at 7 or 8, tell them to stiffen their upper lip and not cry, and you reward emotional detachment. They grow up appearing avoidant because they were taught that vulnerability equals weakness. It's not pathology, it's training. The system practically manufactures emotional distance, then labels it as character building. But that's not attachment theory.
Okay. Yeah,
That's
no, I get
learned
it.
behavior.
Yeah, absolutely. I see that. And then later on, right, those same people are often, they go to therapy and they're told in therapy that because of boarding school, they're avoidantly attached.
Exactly. And when really it's social design, not damage,
Right.
The British upper classes have been exporting emotionally avoidant role models for centuries. It's almost a natural sport at this stage.
I think that might be the most British thing I've ever heard.
Probably, but it shows how slippery this all is. What gets called avoidant in therapy can be resilient or self-contained elsewhere. Same behavior, but a different value system.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll say, though, however, some clients do find comfort in the language because it helps them notice tendencies like chasing reassurance or, withdrawing under pressure without shame. Because using it lightly, it can be helpful, I would say.
Used lightly, fine. Used as gospel, it's misleading. It's like using a weather forecast to explain geology. There's overlap, but it's the wrong scale.
That's a very pool analogy.
I mean, I do try. Look, Bowlby himself wasn't the villain here. He warned that early experience matters, but it's not destiny. The problem is what came after that. The pop psychology industry turned complex developmental research into TikTok personality quizzes, and therapists ran with it.
Right. And yet for all the skepticism, the core message still stands. You know, people need reliable connections to thrive. That's hardly controversial.
No, that's basic biology. You don't need attachment theory to tell you that. Every social mammal on the planet does better in stable groups. We could have saved ourselves 70 years of circular debate and just studied meerkats.
Okay, for sure. But they don't buy self-help books, so what are you going to do?
And this is the problem. You know, they don't buy self-help books. You know, if meerkats did therapy, they'd call it pack work and charge for the burrow or something. Who knows?
Maybe the takeaway here is that attachment theory has some useful ideas, but it's not the skeleton key to human behavior.
Precisely. So use it as a hypothesis if you must, not as a religion. It's a tool. It's blunt. It's occasionally useful, but it is not the entire toolbox.
Right. And perhaps the more honest question isn't what's my attachment style, but how do I behave when I'm afraid of losing connection?
Yeah, and I mean, that's the only version worth answering. Everything else is just branding. It is a brand. Attachment theory is a money-making brand.
I absolutely see that. And, you know, I actually think that's maybe one thing that we can securely agree on.
No, don't start. We're not agreeing with you on any of this.